welcome into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time. It is draft day today, folks. And as of recording this, it is 1 week. It is Thursday, April 17th, prior to the draft, 1 week, and a few hours. I can smell some dinner cooking away through the vents here. So I want to fly through this. I just filmed it, and it was quite a bit longer, and I want to release this on draft day. I want you to be able to watch the video fairly quickly, so I'm going to edit both of them and see which one I like more, going into more detail or not really going into a whole lot of detail, not explaining a whole lot of this. What we're doing in this mock draft is going to be a perfect prediction of what will happen tonight, and apparently there will be 0 trades tonight because I'm going to go through what I think are the most 3 likely potential options at each pick for these teams, for every team, all 32 teams, and then I'm gonna make the pick. So to start this off, for the Tennessee Titans, I think that the most likely scenario is Cam Ward. The second most likely scenario, I don't even have a third. For the most part, we're sticking around about 3 most likely scenarios for teams, would be to trade back. By the way, I'm going to be live tonight for the draft, so please come visit me. That would be awesome to see you there, or tomorrow or the next day, whatever. I know a lot of people do, go live for the draft. Stick with me. Just come visit me and then go back and watch your favorite content creator. If I'm not your favorite, if I'm your favorite, you better frickin' be there. Anyways, Tennessee Titans' second most likely option would be to trade back, but I feel like that would have happened at this stage in the process, so I will be pretty shocked if it's not Cam Ward getting taken to the Tennessee Titans. Did even write Shedeur Sanders down as the third best option, as the third most likely option, because it doesn't seem like that's likely at all. That brings us on to the Cleveland Browns, pick 2 here. Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, I think, is the most likely scenario. Second most likely scenario, I still think Shedeur Sanders possible. Ashton Jeanty, I have as the third most likely scenario. But I think ultimately Travis Hunter is the most likely scenario. New York Giants, I think the most likely scenario is going to be Abdul Carter if Travis Hunter's gone, or Travis Hunter if Abdul Carter's gone. Second most likely scenario, Shedeur Sanders. Third most likely scenario, Mason Graham. That's possible. But Abdul Carter's still available, so let's go with that route. New England Patriots up on the clock. If Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter are available, I think one of those two is the pick here, or maybe it's a pick for a different team, trading back. That's my most likely scenario if one of those two is available to either trade back or, take one of those two. Will Campbell is my second most likely scenario. Honestly, I probably should have put Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter / trade back as like my third most likely scenario based on how I do this for the rest of the mock draft. But anyways, Will Campbell, offensive line in general, is my next highest likely scenario, with Armand Membu being just a little bit less likely than Will Campbell. And my third or fourth most likely scenario here, sixth if you really want to count each individual potential that I've just gone through, is Shedeur McMillan. I still think that there is a high enough chance that I wanted to point that one out. But Will Campbell, I think, most likely. That brings us on to Jacksonville. Mason Graham, most likely scenario. Ashton Jeanty, second most likely scenario. Shedeur McMillan, I think third most likely scenario because I like Ashton Jeanty more. And a dark horse pick here, Jahdae Barron. Could be a surprise pick. Probably not going to happen, but if it does happen, you heard it here first. Las Vegas at pick 6. I think Ashton Jeanty is the most likely scenario. I think the second most likely scenario is wide receiver Shedeur McMillan. And I ended up putting Jahdae Barron as the third most likely scenario. That seems really bold, but that's where my mind ended up going. That's bringing us on to the New York Jets here at pick 7. I think most likely Armand Membu. I think he's probably still available, but if he's not available, then Will Campbell's probably available. That's my second most likely scenario. I also think Jalen Walker could be a possibility, generally edge rusher, and T-Mac or Barron I have as like a 4th, 5th scenario here, Jahdae Barron, Shedeur McMillan, but Armand Membu is available, so we're going to go with that as the most likely scenario. Carolina, I think Jalen Walker specifically most likely scenario, edge rusher in general most likely scenario. I have the second most likely scenario as a trade up or trade down, and Mason Graham third most likely. So we're going to go with Jalen Walker since he is still available, and I wrote his name down. New Orleans up on the clock next. I wrote Shedeur McMillan as the most likely scenario. That is a bit of a surprise to me. Will Johnson right in there as the second most likely scenario. Third most likely scenario, if Armand Membu, Will Campbell, or Mason Graham are available, would be one of them over even a Shedeur McMillan or Will Johnson if they're available. But I just think that those three are probably gone by here, but maybe not. And I have Shedeur Sanders, of course, as a possible likely scenario for New Orleans. But I have Tetairoa McMillan as the most likely, so let's choose that. Chicago up on the clock next here. I have edge rusher as the most likely scenario, best edge rusher available of their choosing, just an edge rusher. Tyler Warren I have as the second most likely scenario. Ashton Jeanty is the third most likely scenario because I think it's more likely that Ashton Jeanty is gone by this point. And a trade up or a trade down I think is also very likely for Chicago. Enough that I mentioned it, but I wrote edge rusher. The question is there an edge rusher remaining that I think that they could take? I do think maybe Mike Green will be the man for them. So let's do it. San Francisco. Remember, we're going for perfection here, baby. This is one that it could be anybody. I kind of spray painted this one. Walter Nolan, Kelvin Banks, I think both of those are the most likely scenario, or interior defensive line, offensive line, most likely scenario there. Edge rusher, not too far behind. Jihad Campbell, if it wasn't for the shoulder surgery, I think anywhere from pick 8, 7, I don't know. Anywhere in the top 10 all the way down to pick 19 is like the most likely scenario for him. But with the shoulder surgery, that is going to push him probably down boards. A trade up for San Francisco wouldn't shock me, and Tyler Warren wouldn't shock me either. All of those, I think, are possibilities, but I did write Walter Nolan as the most likely scenario, so that's what we're going to do, and that's going to bring us on to Dallas. I said Tetairoa McMillan, I think, is the most likely scenario. Edge rusher, second most likely scenario. Kenneth Grant, I wrote as the third most likely scenario, but I ended up going with Michael Williams via the consensus board. So a lot of times when I write like edge rusher down, then I'm starting to go to the consensus board to see if that's higher than maybe potentially also a name that I've written down. That's going to bring us on to Miami. I don't know where my head was at maybe in this one. I wrote Malachi Starks as the most likely scenario. I only had that over Kelvin Banks Jr. because I do think that there's a pretty decent chance that Kelvin Banks Jr. goes at pick 12, 11, 10, 9, any of those, probably not higher than that. So that's why I wrote Malachi Starks over Kelvin Banks. I wasn't really thinking when I prepared for this, and I took Malachi Starks here. So that's what we're going to do. I'm not going to go off board because I'm trying to get through this quickly. But Malachi Starks, and then Walter Nolan I have as the third most likely scenario. He's already gone. Indianapolis, Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland as the two most likely scenarios. And then the interior offensive line, Indianapolis as the third most likely scenario. Guard, probably. Edge rusher as the fourth most likely scenario. So we'll go with Tyler Warren. Atlanta, defensive line and edge rusher I have as the most likely scenario. I have a trade back, second most likely scenario for Atlanta. Jahdae Barron, and then Matthew Golden as my a likely enough scenario that I wanted to point that out, as well as the Jahdae Barron. But defensive line, edge rusher, I think, is the highest chance of happening. Trade back, second most highest chance. One of those most likely. But in this situation, we are going to go. Shamar Stewart was the highest defensive lineman via the consensus. I think overall defensive lineman, but for sure edge rusher. Arizona, I think most likely scenario is that Will Johnson will be available and that they will take him. Also, one of the interior defensive line between Kenneth Grant, Walter Nolan, Derek Harmon, very possible. Offensive line, very possible. And as a dark horse, I think that wide receiver could be the pick here too. Wouldn't shock me. But we will go with Will Johnson here to Arizona. Cincinnati at pick 17. I think that edge rusher is the most likely scenario for them. However, some of the bigger names that we think are going to go this high are off the board already. Gray Zabel, Kelvin Banks, I have as the second most likely scenario. And so this is going to be the route that I'm going to end up going via consensus, given who's left at the edge rusher position as well. And Malachi Starks is the third most likely scenario to Cincinnati. Surprise, surprise. But Kelvin Banks was highest up on the consensus, so that is the route that we go here for Cincinnati. Seattle up at pick 18. And for Seattle, this is an interesting one. I had offensive line as the most likely scenario. Will Johnson being the second most likely scenario. He's off the board. Colston Loveland being the third most likely scenario. So I ended up looking at the consensus between the offensive linemen that are still available and Colston Loveland. Colston Loveland's the highest out of the group, so that's what we're going to do. But also, I think Seattle trading back from this spot would potentially, I think there's a high enough chance that there will be a team wanting to move up here and that they'll be willing to move back, that I wanted to include that as a likely enough scenario. But at the end of the day, it is Colston Loveland here for this perfect example of what will happen tonight. Tampa Bay, I think if Jihad Campbell's available, he's there. I think that's less likely given the shoulder surgery, but we will do that because he is expected to miss quite a bit of time due to that shoulder surgery, and his development process will be stunted due to that. Edge rusher is the second most likely scenario, and then I think Gray Zabel, Calvin Banks, could either one of them also be the pick here at pick 19. Going on to pick 20 for the Denver Broncos, I think Emeka Egbuka is the most likely scenario, wide receiver in general, but I think that's just the name that I wrote as the most likely scenario. Omarion Hampton, second most likely scenario, and Grant Nolan Harmon, most likely scenario. Now, I don't know that I think Emeka Egbuka over Omarion Hampton necessarily is the case, but Emeka Egbuka is still available, so is Omarion Hampton. Nonetheless, I wrote the most likely pick, not necessarily most likely, but I'm going to be ultra Omarion Hampton's still there, so I'm going to take him. In this scenario, I just went with the name that I wrote the highest up there. So Emeka Egbuka, running back, wide receiver, interior defensive line. It's almost surely going to be one of those three at pick 20, I believe, for Denver. Tight end, shouldn't write that off, but I also think high enough chance that they'll be gone, and high enough chance that they'll also want one of those positions over a tight end anyways. At pick 21, Pittsburgh, I wrote Shedeur Sanders, or is it Jalen Milroe? I've been talking about that all offseason. Defense. You can write a story about why they would need a player at any position along their defense. So I know that that's very generic, but I think defense is the second. A defensive player is the second most likely situation. Third most likely situation is to trade back. Fourth most likely situation is Omarion Hampton, who my comp is a juiced up Najee Harris essentially, so we know they like that type. But we are going to go with the top. Shedeur Sanders still available? Nope. Pulling the rug out from under you. We're going to go Jalen Milroe. I've talked about this in the past. I think Jalen Milroe could be the apple of the eye in Pittsburgh. That's very possible based on what I think Tomlin covets the most in quarterbacks. That brings us on to the Los Angeles Chargers. Kenneth Grant, I think, is the most likely scenario here, so we're going to do that. But defensive line, interior or edge, is the second most likely scenario, just anywhere along the defensive line if it's not Kenneth Grant. And then third most likely option is a cornerback. Maybe one falls to them that they want, or maybe they reach for one. Could be the case. At pick 23, the Green Bay Packers are up on the board. And here's where I actually think the most likely scenario is a trade down. Not by a big margin, but that's what I wrote as the most likely scenario. I also think cornerback is the second most likely scenario. Wide receiver, I have as the third most likely scenario. And I have a dark horse option here. Instead of trading down, maybe they've already made their decision. Maybe they traded up for Teteroa McMillan. Could that be possible if he's still on the board there at pick 18, 19? I think it could be possible. But nonetheless, in this scenario, I have the Green Bay Packers going cornerback because that's we're not trading down. And in a twist, I went with Trey Amos, even with Jahdae Barron still being here. In part, maybe that's just because I think Jahdae Barron will be gone at this pick, but also because Green Bay already has 5 other guys who fill that slot cornerback safety type of role. It really clogs up the room, so I went Trey Amos, which makes me cry because that leaves Jahdae Barron available to division rival in Minnesota, which, I don't want to see that happen. And I do think that outside of trading down from this pick, a cornerback is the most likely scenario. And look, if Jahdae Barron's still available here, I shouldn't say a cornerback. I think a defensive back of any sort. Slot, cornerback, perimeter, or safety, all available. I wrote Jahdae Barron, Starks, Amos as the most likely picks for them if they don't trade down. And Derek Harmon is the other most likely pick. So I am going Jahdae Barron because at this point he has fallen, and I did write his name as the second most likely scenario. That is going to bring us on to pick 25 for the Houston Texans. And don't do this to me because I've got to go to dinner. I guess I'm going to have to pick up recording this later. That will bring us on to Houston at pick 25. Offensive line, interior defensive line, I have as pretty much the most likely scenario and of equal opportunity for either one of those to happen, as well as my second or third most likely scenario would be a wide receiver. So in this situation for Houston, I ended up going with Josh Simmons being, I think, probably the highest one up in the, what's that called? on the consensus board, that is going to bring us on to the Los Angeles Rams. And for this pick, I have Maxwell Hairston, cornerback, as the most likely scenario. Carson Schwessinger as the second most likely scenario. That's interesting, I think. And trade down as the third most likely scenario, with the caveat or the prediction that if they do trade down, that it is going to be a wide receiver that they take either with that pick or like helping some of the capital that they acquired and moving down to help move their second pick up to get a wide receiver of their choice, would be kind of the idea there. So at 26, Maxwell Harrison is still available, so that is where we will go. The Baltimore Ravens on the clock at pick 27. I have the most likely scenario being either Tyler Booker or Donovan Jackson, whichever one they prefer. Derek Harmon, interior defensive line in general. If one of them were to fall to Baltimore, I think that would be very enticing for them. Carson Schwessinger I have as the third most likely scenario, third. And then they are a wild card. I don't really feel too strongly about any scenario. I think wide receiver, a slot cornerback, or just a perimeter cornerback, wide receiver, again, maybe I meant to write something else, and trading up are all going to be very much also a possibility for Baltimore. So I don't have this being like some major prediction, but I am going to end up going Tyler Booker. That was my highest odds there and name that I wrote. In terms of consensus being also the highest. Detroit Lions, I have Donovan Ezraku or James Pierce, just in general, and edge being the most likely scenario, and most notably, Donovan Ezraku or James Pierce Jr. Wide receiver, I have as the second most likely scenario. I think that there's a wide variety of wide receivers that they might have a preference for, and exactly, just the odds, I guess. I think second overall for them to take a wide receiver. And third of all, offensive line in general, but I did write down a specific name, being Ariante Ursary. Don't be surprised if you see that. At the end of the day, we are hunting for a Super Bowl, and I think that James Pierce gives you something that you can't too often find here at pick 28 in the draft, so we're going to go for that. James Pierce Jr. to the Detroit Lions at pick 29. Washington up on the clock. Interior offensive line I have as the most likely scenario. Edge rusher, second most likely scenario. Cornerback being the third most likely scenario. And I do think that a safety is a dark horse pick here for them. But at the end of the day, there are some offensive linemen still available that I think, pretty highly of in terms of where they'll end up going in the draft. So I ended up going with Gray Zabel here, and that's something unique. I have never gone Gray Zabel to Washington. I don't think I very rarely have him available to Washington. So there we go. Most likely scenario ends up being Gray Zabel to Washington. Look at that. The Buffalo Bills are up on the clock. Most likely scenario, a defensive back of any sort, probably cornerback, but could be a safety. I think if it's a safety, it'd be a free safety, not a strong safety. I also have the second most likely scenario. I have it being Tyleik Williams, but interior defensive line in general. I just expect that the interior defensive linemen that are available right now won't be, and that being Derek Harmon. So I wrote Tyleik Williams, but also any of those, big three names that I wrote, Nolan, Harmon, or Kenneth Grant, if they're available, also would be options. I think a trade up or back is also an option for Buffalo, depending on the board, and if anybody falls, like for instance, Jahdae Barron were to fall, maybe they'd move up for him. And then a dark horse would be a wide receiver pick for Buffalo. I wouldn't be absolutely shocked. In this situation, I ended up having them go with Derek Harmon. For the Kansas City Chiefs, we went offensive or defensive line as the most likely scenario. I know, that's kind of a cop-out in a sense, but at this point, there's just so many people that could be falling, that they could have high opinions on, that they could take at this point. So that's what I wrote down. I wrote a trade up as being the second most likely scenario, and in that scenario, they'd be trading up for offensive line. Probably not defensive line. And then a dark horse pick here for them as well, a safety. Wouldn't be absolutely shocked. So maybe a safety goes here towards the end of the first round. But I keep having something more important being available. And Donovan Ezraku is still available for Kansas City. I didn't write interior defensive line. I wrote defensive line, including edge rushers. So Donovan Ezraku, it is going to be for Kansas City. And with the final pick of this draft, the Philadelphia Eagles First most likely, highest likely scenario, I have James Pierce Jr., but I wrote a falling defensive lineman most likely to be James Pierce Jr., but in this situation, he did get taken higher. But, if a Donovan Azaraku makes it to this point or something like that, I think that that's probably where they end up going. But they also have a need at cornerback. That's my second most likely scenario. And third up, offensive guard, or just like I wrote for Detroit, Ariante Ursary specifically, I think, would fit a lot of the mold of what the Philadelphia Eagles look for in offensive linemen. At the end of the day here, defensive line have not falling edge rushers, interior defensive linemen. All the ones that I think are like first-round locks have gone off the board. But that brings me to cornerbacks. And so you can't expect any of these guys to be available when you come back around the turn at the end of the second round. So we will grab one now. Looking at them, I don't know for sure who they'll pick, but I went with the highest consensus, which was Savone Ravel, and I think that Savone Ravel would make a lot of sense for this team because he fits like their character wants. They like to have good character guys, and they like to have hard-working dudes. And if you know anything about Savone Ravel's story, basically he didn't take the NIL money, so he's been working at like Amazon warehouses throughout the night shifts, and then doing football stuff during the days. So I think that's something that they would find enticing, and play style is a perfect fit in Philadelphia. So that is it for the first round. I hope you like it. Let me know what you did, what you didn't like. Remember, this is exactly what you will see happen tonight. 0 trades, obviously, too. So thank you very much. I've had a wonderful season. I hope you enjoy the draft, and don't forget to come visit me if you are watching it here on YouTube. Peace out.